Good morning. I'm Professor Laurie Hodrick, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the Inaugural Program for Financial Studies Conference. Today we gather to discuss finance in a world of uncertainties, including fiscal uncertainties, complex risks, and uncertain valuations. The program for today will proceed as follows. We begin with a keynote address by Erskine Bowles, followed by two concurrent panels, which will be held on the third floor. Panel 1 will discuss asset management in a world of uncertain risks, and Panel 2 will discuss corporate finance in a world of uncertain valuations. Information about the panelists is available in your program. Your name tag indicates which panel you have selected, and beverages will be available in the back of each panel room. By the way, both panels are being videotaped today, so if you're interested in also experiencing the other panel, you'll be able to watch the video once it's posted on our program's website. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Erskine Bowles. A graduate of Columbia Business School, Mr. Bowles' distinguished career spans military service, the financial sector, government, and higher education. A native North Carolinian, Mr. Bowles pursued a financial services career in investment banking, venture capital, and private equity. Throughout his business career, he served on the boards of various corporations, including Morgan Stanley, General Motors, and Facebook. In 1993, Mr. Bowles was named as President Clinton's Deputy Chief of Staff, and shortly thereafter became Chief of Staff. In this capacity, he served as a member of the President's Cabinet and on both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. Working at the direction of the President and with a Republican Congress, Mr. Bowles negotiated the first balanced budget in a generation. During his tenure in the White House, he coordinated the federal response to the Oklahoma City bombing, and he later joined the United Nations as Deputy Special Envoy with the rank of Undersecretary General to coordinate the global response to the tsunami in Southeast Asia in 2004. From 2005 to 2010, Mr. Bowles served as president of the University of North Carolina, overseeing 17 campuses, 220,000 students, 40,000 employees, and an annual budget of approximately $8 billion. In 2010, President Barack Obama appointed Mr. Bowles to co-chair the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform with former Senator Alan Simpson. This bipartisan commission produced a plan to reduce the nation's deficits by $4 trillion over the next decade. Our conference today explores finance in a world of uncertainties. I am certain how lucky we are to share the insights of such a distinguished leader, and it is my honor to introduce Erskine Bowles.
You all have no idea how hard that was for Laurie. She's a Duke graduate. There are lots of things that have gone through my mind as I walked on the campus this morning. One of my old classmates is here, David DeLue, and I remembered our first day in class at the business school, and I'm sure it's not that way anymore here. It certainly wasn't at Keenan Flagler at Chapel Hill. But the first day of class, we all were told that class participation was 50% of your grade. You had to wear a coat and tie to class. You had to rise to answer all questions. And so the professor asked a simple question in a baby marketing course. I said, hey, man, I know the answer to that question. So I stood up and I answered it. I sat back down, and he looked at me and said, Mr. Bowles, Erskine Bowles. And I was flabbergasted because at Chapel Hill, they didn't know your name the last day, much less the first day. He said, you're either going to have to learn to speak the English language as well as the foreign students, or you're going to make an F in my course. I said, wow, what am I doing here? The other thing I thought about as Laurie went through that was when my Uncle Sam back in Greensboro, North Carolina, passed away. And the obituary editor of Greensboro Daily News called up to ask about him. And my aunt kind of went on and on talking about him a little bit like Laurie did in my resume. And finally, the obituary editor said, now, Miss Bowles, you do know that we now charge $5 a word for every word we put in the obituary. She said, oh, I didn't know that. She said, in that case, just put in there, Sam died. For better or worse, it's a true story. And he said, well, Miss Bowles, you say we can't do that. Oh, she said, oh, no. He said, we got this 5-word minimum. Oh, she said, that's no problem. She said, put in there, Sam died. Cadillac for sale. I'm sure that's what my wife is going to do. She's also a smart Columbia graduate. I'm really happy to be here. I noticed that Dr. Hardrick is a Roger Murray fellow, and he was a great professor here when I was at Columbia. And I wanted to do this because Columbia means a lot to me. I can point to the education I got here and the friends I made and the experiences I had as a big part of a success I've had in my life. So I'm very grateful and proud to be a graduate of this business school. In thinking about what I would say today, I thought I would just talk to you the way I did to the super committee in the Congress on Tuesday. I met with these guys to talk about how I thought we could solve this long-term fiscal problem our nation faces. And it was an easy meeting for me because I know all these guys really well, and I've worked with all of them on both sides of the aisle. And I have great respect for each member of that super committee individually. But collectively, I'm worried they're going to fail the country. When Alan Simpson and I first agreed to say yes to the president to head this National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, we thought we were doing it for our grandkids. I have 9 and he has 6. And we began to study the information and to look at the numbers again and to update ourselves. And the more we looked at the numbers, the more dire we knew the situation was. And we quickly realized we weren't doing it for our grandkids. We weren't even doing it for our kids. We were doing it for us. I think we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. I know the fiscal path that Washington is on is not sustainable. And I also know that every member of that super committee knows the arithmetic and understands the economics. I can tell you that if I were going to give you an analogy of where we are today, I would say that these deficits are like a cancer, and they are literally going to destroy this country from within if we don't do something, and we don't do something relatively quick. Most people ask me, and the first question I get when I talk to them, well, what are the causes of this deficit? Why do we have the cause? And I always turn it back to them and say, well, you tell me what the causes are. Why do you think we have these big, huge trillion-dollar deficits every year? And in general, they say the same 4 things. They say it's waste, fraud, and abuse. They say it's oil subsidies. They say it's foreign aid. And some people say Nancy Pelosi's airplane. Those are the 4 things I hear most of the time. Those are the imaginary reasons. Those, if you added them all up, would be, an infinitesimally small part of the budget and the problem we face today. The budget deficit today is caused primarily by 4 basic problems. First is health care, over and above everything else. We spend as a nation twice as much on health care as any other developed country, whether you talk about it as a percent of GDP or on a per capita basis. And yet our outcomes are somewhere, we rank between 25th and 50th in things like infant mortality and preventable death and life expectancy. And the 50 million people who don't have health care insurance, they get health care. They just get into the emergency room at 5 to 7 times the cost it'd be in a doctor's office. And that cost doesn't disappear. It gets cost shifted to us in the form of higher taxes and higher insurance costs. So healthcare is our number one problem. It is growing at a faster rate than GDP. Second biggest problem is the amount we spend on defense. We spend more than the next 14 largest countries combined on defense. It's crazy. It's crazy. The third reason is we give away half of income we take in normally in revenue in the form of taxes, in the form of deductions and credits, or really just backdoor spending in the tax code. We have the most inefficient, ineffective, anti-competitive on a global basis tax code that man could dream up. And lastly, interest on the debt. Today, luckily, with where interest rates are, you know, we spend about $200 billion a year on interest. If we do nothing and we just take the ostrich theory and stick our heads in the ground, and interest rates stay low, which I don't think anybody expects they will, by the year 2020, we'll be spending over $1 trillion a year in interest cost alone. Think about that. $1 trillion a year. That's doubly bad for America. Not only is it $1 trillion we can't spend here to invest in education, to educate our kids, or infrastructure, to move our goods and services to the marketplace, or to put in high-speed broadband access to the internet in the rural areas where I live so they can compete in this new economy. You know, it's also $1 trillion that we can't invest in high value-added research, so that next new thing is created here and not somewhere over there. And unfortunately, since half of money we're borrowing today, we're borrowing from Asia, that's $1 trillion that'll be spent over there to educate their kids, to build their infrastructure, you know, to create the next new thing over there. So the jobs of the future are over there, not over here. I think that's crazy. The arithmetic of a budget's pretty easy to understand. If you look at last year's income statement, and unfortunately, if you go see the members of Congress and you ask them real quick, you have an income statement in this hand and a balance sheet in this hand, and you ask them real quick which is which, they ain't gonna know. Yeah, it's true. You wonder why we get some of the legislation we get. But if you look at the income statement, you look at all the revenue the country took in last year, 100%. Every single dollar was spent on our mandatory spending and interest on the debt. Mandatory spending is principally the entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That means every single dollar that we spent last year on these two wars, on defense, on homeland security, on education, on infrastructure, transportation, you know, research, every single dollar was borrowed, and half of it was borrowed from foreign countries. That is a formula for failure, I believe, in anybody's book. And when I watch these guys in Washington in both parties, I think the deficit is certainly not a partisan issue. When I look at these guys go on these Sunday shows and they talk about how we can solve a problem, and some of them say, oh, look, we'll just grow our way out of this problem. You could have double-digit growth for the next 2 decades and not solve this problem. Growth alone won't get us there. And, you know, sometimes there's 1 or 2 more Democrats in the room. Maybe, is there another Democrat here today? Yeah. But, you know, when I watch the Democrats go on the shows and they say, well, look, let's just we can tax our way out of this problem. We can't solely tax our way out of a problem. You know, raising taxes doesn't do a darn thing to change the demographics of a country. It doesn't do a darn thing to change the fact that healthcare is growing at a faster rate than GDP. And if you wanted to solve the problem with taxes alone, you'd have to raise the highest marginal rate to 70%, the corporate rate to 80%, and the cap gains and dividend rate to 50%. Even David Zalesny couldn't make money in that kind of environment. There would be no businesses started in America in a global economy with that kind of tax rate. So we can't solely grow our way out of it. We can't solely tax our way out of it. And having spent this last year and a half beating my head in Washington, I can guarantee you we can't solely cut our way out of a problem. These guys, again, on television who will say, let's solve a problem with just cuts. And basically they say, but I'm not going to touch defense because we got to stay safe and secure, and I'm not going to touch, interest on the debt, we got to pay that, and I'm not going to touch Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security because I want to get reelected. If you leave all that off, you got to cut everything else by 75%, and that's simply just not going to happen. So what our commission tried to do was to come up with a bipartisan recommendation. We got a majority of Republicans, a majority of Democrats on our commission. We ended up getting a super majority of the commission to vote for it. We got a real diverse group to vote for it. We had 6 U.S. senators on our commission, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. All 3 Republicans voted for the commission report. 2 of the 3 Democrats did. And we had all the way from the right, from Tom Coburn, who is the most conservative member of Congress from Oklahoma, to Dick Durbin from Illinois, who is the most liberal member of Congress. So we had real diversity of support in our plan. And basically what we said is we've got to cut these deficits by $4 trillion over the next decade. And we didn't make up the number 4 because the number 4 bus just went down the road here on Morningside Drive. We came up with $4 trillion because it's not the maximum amount we need to reduce the deficit. It's not the ideal amount. It's the minimum, the bare minimum amount we need to reduce the deficit over the next decade to stabilize the debt and get it on a downward path as a percent of GDP. And we did it with 3/4 spending cuts and 1/4 new revenue, the new revenue coming from reforming the tax code. And we didn't want to get caught in one of those quagmires like Ronald Reagan did, where he actually raised revenue, but he did it on the basis they were going to cut spending, and they never cut spending. We said the spending cuts had to come first. The important thing is not so much the arithmetic as the principles that went into getting an agreement. We spent a lot of time thinking about how you balance a budget, not just getting to the right arithmetic results. And we built our proposal around 6 basic principles. And that's what I want to leave you with, and then I'll take any questions about any of the other plans or where we stand now or Europe or whatever you want to talk about. But these 6 principles, I think, are key to understanding how we got bipartisan support. And we have about 45 members of the Senate, an equal number of Republicans and Democrats who support the plan today, 100 members of the House. I think 40 Republicans and 60 Democrats came out and endorsed it yesterday. So we are building up some real momentum. We've had, I think, every Treasury Secretary since Reagan's George Shultz endorsed the plan. Every head of the Council of Economic Advisors since Reagan, all the way through President Obama's first CEA head. So we built up a lot of support for what we recommended. And I think it's because of these principles. The first principle was we didn't want to do anything that I would call overtly stupid. And by that I mean we didn't want to do anything that would disrupt what is clearly a very fragile economic recovery. Now, back in December when we did this, the fragility of the economic recovery was certainly arguable. And many people argued with me and said, Erskine, this recovery is real. You don't have to worry about it being fragile. Go ahead and make big cuts now, because the economy is really in recovery. And they based it on the fact that back in December, if you looked at some of the right statistics, you could see that factory production was starting to go up. The sale of existing homes was starting to increase. Retail sales were up. Trying to remember, unemployment was starting to come down. Banks were starting to lend to small businesses again. Investor sentiment was up. So he said, hey, the recovery's real. Make big cuts now. Don't worry about disrupting a very fragile economic recovery. We worried about it a lot. And the reason is we were very worried about demand. If I remember anything I learned here at Columbia, its demand comes from basically three areas. The consumer being the biggest part of it. Consumer is still about 2/3 of GDP. The consumer remains highly leveraged. I think there's about $13 trillion of household debt out there. It's about 120% of disposable income. Half of it's at a floating rate. Man, you think when gas and food prices went up, it took a bite out of demand. You wait till interest rates start to rise. I didn't see the consumer, leading us out of the abyss. And business, being the next leg, small businesses can't grow and can't create jobs without money. And the banks really aren't lending to small businesses today for lots of different reasons. Some the regulations that we put on them, and some they're just unwilling to take the risk in this kind of environment. So I didn't see small business leading us out, and large businesses, big businesses got a lot of capital, no question about that. But that capital is on strike because it's, really concerned about where we're going. And they don't have the confidence to invest at this point in time. So I didn't see it coming from the consumer or from business at the government. I figured that the federal government had gotten away with all the stimulus it was going to get away with, and that's certainly proven to be right. And when you look at state budgets, almost every state around the nation except for North Dakota, is cutting their budgets. They're laying people off because they have constitutional requirements that you have to balance their budgets. So the growth wasn't going to come there. It certainly wasn't going to come from Europe, and in my opinion, it wasn't going to come from Asia, particularly from China, as they, move from a export-driven economy to a consumption-based economy, and as they try to throttle back their growth. So as far as future growth, we didn't see a lot of it. In fact, we felt we were in what some people call, a long-term contraction where we would have slow growth and relatively high unemployment for a significant period of time. And so we didn't make big cuts in 2011. We didn't make big cuts in 2012. We did make reasonable cuts in 2013. And we got spending back to pre-crisis levels in 2013 to the levels we spent in 2008 in real terms. So we got there, but we got there slowly than some people would want you to. The second principle was we didn't want to do anything to hurt the truly disadvantaged, and I'll speed up, and the truly disadvantaged. And so you won't see any cuts in SSI or food stamps or workers' comp. And on something like Social Security, we actually did some things that made our job harder. We raised the minimum payment on Social Security to 125% of poverty to take care of the truly disadvantaged. And we gave people a 1% bump up between 81 and 86 because that's when every Republican and Democrat economist told us that's when people's private savings start to run out. They need a little help then. And yes, we are the guys who raised the retirement age, the eligibility age for Social Security. We raised it 1 year, 40 years from now. We wanted to give people a chance to get ready. You would not believe the hate mail, death threats, everything I've gotten over that. It's like crazy. And I think what the AARP is doing today is unconscionable. I mean, I think it's really just dead wrong. But I can tell you this Roosevelt guy's pretty smart. When Roosevelt put in Social Security, you know, average life expectancy was 63. You got Social Security when you were 65. I don't believe I can get away with that today. But it's really smart. You know, today, you know, you get it at 62, average life expectancy 78. You know, we got an arithmetic problem. What we did is we put in the various changes to Social Security to make it sustainably solvent. And that's what I think we have to do so people can count on it as their bedrock layer of support. And we hope those changes will occur. The third principle was we did want to make sure the country was safe and secure. But you can't spend more than the next 14 largest countries combined on defense and think you can also invest in this country in the things we need to invest in to be competitive in a knowledge-based global economy. So we made some cuts in defense. We laid them out specifically what they were. What we're doing today is crazy. The best example I can give you is we have a treaty with Taiwan that we will protect Taiwan if they're invaded by the Chinese. There's only one problem with that. We got to borrow the money from the Chinese to do it, you know? It's really true, you know? You guys should go to work in Washington sometime. The fourth for us was we thought the president was right, or at least half right, in the State of the Union when he said America must invest in education, infrastructure, and high-value-added research. He's right about that, you know, if we're going to compete in a knowledge-based global economy. But what he left off was we have to do it in a fiscally responsible manner. You know, we live in a world of limited resources. Limited resources mean one thing: choices, priorities. It's no different than when you do a leveraged buyout. Choices, priorities, because you don't have enough money to just throw it up against the wall. One of the things I wanted to do when I was president of UNC was to do our part to improve K through 12. And I figured since we produced most of the teachers, we had a moral responsibility and an economic responsibility to produce not just more teachers, but better teachers and more math and science teachers. So we set out on that effort, and the first thing I asked is, well, you know, where can I get some money? And so we looked at Uncle Sam. And I said, do they have any programs to improve the quality of teacher education? Yeah, they got 82 programs. Now, do we need 2 or 3 good ones? You bet your life we do, but we don't need 82. You look at research. At Chapel Hill, we do $1.5 billion worth of federal scientific research every year. Is all of that high value-added research? No way. It's not. We live in a world of limited resources. We have to make choices. It's a little bit like the famous Nobel Prize-winning chemist Ernst Rutherford said when his Nobel project was running out of money. He turned to his team and he said, "We're running out of money. Now we got to start thinking." You know, that's what America is. We're running out of money. We got to start thinking. We can't just do everything. We got to set priorities. We got to make choices. Fifth, we have the most anti-competitive, inefficient, ineffective tax code that man could dream up. We net $1 trillion in total revenue in the tax code every year from corporate and individual taxes. And people wonder, how can rates be so high and net so little? And the answer is we give away $1.1 trillion in deductions and credits, or what I call backdoor spending, or tax earmarks in the tax code, which benefit a lot of us in this room, including me. We said, look, what if we just get rid of all of those tax earmarks? Just all of them, wipe them out. And we use 92% of that money to reduce income tax rates, and 8% of the money to reduce the deficit. What could happen? We simplify the code, we broaden the base, we take these tax expenditures and we use 92% of it to reduce rates, 8% to reduce the deficit. Well, you could reduce the deficit by about $1 trillion over 10 years. So that's where I get my revenue money from. And you could reduce individual rates to 8% up to $70,000, 14% up to $210,000, and have a maximum rate of 23%. You could take the corporate rate to 26%, and you could pay for a territorial plan, a territorial system, so that that $1 trillion that's captured overseas could be brought back here to create jobs over here. I think it would create dynamic growth and produce literally thousands and thousands of jobs in the U.S. And I think it makes just good common sense. The last principle was we got to get serious about spending cuts. What I watched in the first 6 months of this year in Washington was pitiful. I mean, really pitiful. You know, they cut, what, $40 billion, out of a deficit. $40 billion sounds like a lot of money until you think it's $40 billion out of a $3.8 trillion budget. That's 1.1%. I cut 15% out of the university budget last year alone. There's not a business guy in this room that couldn't cut their budget by 1.1% by tomorrow. We got to get serious about spending cuts. And we got to cut spending wherever we find it, whether it's in the tax code, the defense budget, the non-defense budget, in the entitlement programs, wherever it is. I'm confident that if we do reduce the deficit by at least $4 trillion over the next decade, that it will create real growth in this economy, and it will create a lot of confidence for people to make the kind of investments we have to make. And I think if we don't, we are well on our ways to becoming a second-rate power in our lifetime. So I hope you'll help me on this. I think it's really important, and I'll be glad to take any questions you have.
We're going to invite people to come up to the microphone if they have questions. And while people are doing that, and please, Erskine has been generous enough to offer to answer questions, so please take him up on it. While we're doing that, I would like to offer this token of our appreciation, and thank you so much for your thoughts today.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. It must be especially hard for her to work here and wrapping everything in Carolina blue. You don't need to offer me anything. You gave me a great education. It's been invaluable during my entire life, and I thank you for that. Paul.
Erskine, you did answer one of the questions I was going to ask, is whether this super committee is even talking to you, so at least that's good. But I was always surprised, and I can't remember the exact timing, that after you and Senator Simpson issued the report, I mean, the whole idea, I thought, was to use this as a basis for at least discussion if people didn't adopt exactly what you proposed. It seemed to me that you rendered the report typically of a lot of these kind of commissions, and everybody just ignored it. And I'd just like to see whether, in fact, that's an accurate assessment, and then why, when when this high-level kind of commission gets appointed.
Fair question. Getting a question from Paul, it's like getting a question when you're terrified in your class because you know somebody smarter than you is asking you a question. We worked together at Morgan Stanley when they had about 150 employees worldwide. They now have 40,000. So, very different world today. When I negotiated the balanced budget in 1997, I knew my client. I knew Bill Clinton. I didn't know Monica, but I knew Bill Clinton. And therefore, when I went to meet with Gingrich and Lott, I could negotiate in good faith. And to get it done, I had to spend months and months locked up in conference rooms with Gingrich and Lott, and y'all owe me a lot for that, I'm telling you. But we did get it done. I did not know President Obama well before I agreed to co-head this with Alan. So I did what any of you all would have done. I said, if you don't know your client, then you darn well better find out what success is. You better define success. You better know what they want if you're going to go in and negotiate some kind of deal, because you don't want to end up here and have your client way over here. And so I spent a lot of time with him and with his economic team. All the economic team I know, because they all worked for me when I was chief of staff. And I was confident I knew what they wanted and what success was. And during the course of our 9 months, we did build up trust and confidence, and were able to get a supermajority of a commission to vote for it. And our recommendations that got this supermajority support exceeded every single guideline I'd been given by the president. So I really did think that, man, he was going to, ooh, like Bill Clinton, he would have said, oh, I love this. As a matter of fact, it was all my idea. But it didn't happen, you know, and I knew the economic team liked what we had done. And in any White House, there's a small group that surrounds the president that has an awful lot of influence. And in this presidency, that group is principally the political guys that he has known and worked with for a long time. It's, you know, Pluff and Axelrod and Gibbs and Valerie Jarrett. And they talked him out of it, not for the economic reasons, but for political reasons, because they felt it was better, I guess, for the Republicans to go first, for Paul Ryan to get out there with his budget, and then he could come out with his, and the president would look like the reasonable guy. I thought that was bad advice at the time and said so. I then thought that he would come forward and support what we did when he did the stimulus in the end of December, the short-term stimulus, and because I thought it made just good common sense to couch that into terms of long-term fiscal reform. And he didn't. His first budget didn't. He has been spending time since then trying to get back to where we were. He's since then come out with 2 additional budgets. One was a $4 trillion deficit reduction plan over 12 years, but it was so heavily back-end loaded, it really was about $2.5 trillion when you put it on an apples-to-apples basis. And then he just a month ago came out with a new $4 trillion deficit reduction plan over 10 years. But in there, they've got and you have to tell the truth, in there he's got a budget gimmick of $1.1 trillion, which is about a third of the spending cuts, which is due to the drawdown of the troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's already in the baseline. So that's, you know, not comparable again. Again, he's gotten there have been a lot of people who've come out since then to try to encourage him to go there. I went through a litany of some of them, and I think we're still moving back in that direction. At the end of the day, you know, there are just not that many ways to solve this problem. We have to solve it, or the bond market's going to solve it for us. And so we either get there now or we get there later, but it's better to do it now. And as people go through it, they seem to always come back to something similar to what we recommended.
Thank you. Mr.
Can you
Bowles,
tell me who you are?
Rob Fleischer. And during your analysis as part of the commission, did you ever look at the impact of the incremental cost of each year of expected life duration on the economy in terms of the deficit and our fiscal health?
It'd be a good thing if I could answer that yes, but we didn't per se. When you do this kind of thing in Washington, again, it's so different than anything you do in the real world. You have to work within the parameters of economic assumptions handed out by the Congressional Budget Office. They are the arbitrator of anything that's reasonable, and if you take assumptions that are different than what they have, then they'll say they're not right, they're not accurate, you know, and everybody will start to disagree based on, and you'll never get to the real answer. And the economic assumptions that we worked with, I think you can say, are pretty aggressive. Certainly much more than I think under a structural contraction theory we'll actually have. But the economic growth that's forecast that we used over the next 5 years would have in 3 of those 5 years growth in excess of 3%, 4%, and 5%, which I don't believe will happen. So the answer is no, but we probably should have.
When you look at life expectancy, is a huge part of the problem. You go back to the example you gave Roosevelt, go from 63 to 75, 76, wherever we are right now. If it was 63 right now, we'd probably be in decent shape, right?
Oh yeah, look, we can solve it. We can solve this problem. Social Security is really easy to solve. You have to make really some very minor adjustments in order to get it to be sustainably solvent over a long period of time. If we do nothing, this is what I don't understand about the Democrats. If we do nothing, it absolutely will go broke in 2036. And under current law, the payments will have to be reduced in that year by 22% and by more each and every year, because then it's got to be on a pay-for basis. And, that's crazy. Why don't we, make it sustainably solvent? Why don't we do the kinds of things we recommend? Let's improve it for the people at the bottom. And for people like me, you don't even have to cut the payment going out. You just have to slow the rate of growth a little bit for people at the, in the top 15%. I think that makes good sense. But they got the AARP out there hammering on them, and they don't want to touch it. They have a defender, and I think they're doing a real disservice to our, to the current generation and to the next generation. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks so much for the insights. It's really interesting. I'm Andrew Rusikoff, a recent student of Professor Hodrick's, and with respect to rolling back and reversing the deductions, it's just independent from all the benefits of lowering taxes and simplifying the tax code. Like, are you concerned about destabilizing in the short term asset values that rely on those tax deductions and what the impacts of those might be?
Yeah, that's something we did spend a lot of time on. The one that people talk about the most is housing, which is already destabilized. No other, just from a macro viewpoint, no other country in the world gives you deduction on your mortgage interest deduction. And secondly, it was surprising to me to find out that only about 25% of Americans actually itemize. So they don't get any, most people, the average American doesn't get any benefit out of a mortgage interest deduction. What we did is we went to, we called it the zero plan. Let's get rid of all of them at first. And then if you want to add back some of these deductions, then add them back. But tell us who's going to pay for it, okay? Because they're not free. We put a plan out that added back an option that people could look at that kept the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, it kept the mortgage interest deduction, but changed it, and the charitable deduction, but changed it. The way we changed the mortgage interest deduction and the charitable deduction was a mortgage interest deduction. We made it a credit instead of a deduction, and you got a 12% credit on a primary residence up to $500,000. So if you had a $500,000 mortgage at 6%, that'd be $30,000 worth of interest. You get a 12% credit, that'd be a $3,600 credit. That would help a lot more people than the current system we have and cost a hell of a lot less money for the taxpayers. So we looked at those things, and if you did that, if you kept all of those deductions I just mentioned, then you'd have to take rates instead of at 8, 14, and 23, you'd have to take rates to, I think it was 14, 22, and 28. So it just shows you the effect that these deductions and credits have on your various individual income tax rates.
But other than kind of secondary effects of housing prices go down, then people are underwater on their mortgages. I mean, I'm just concerned about all those things and wondering on like what would be the impacts of that, and then all the other things that are going on with the housing prices that are in flux.
Well, we certainly had the tax policy look at the correlating effects of it, and all you got to do is read the report. It's right in there.
Oh, thanks.
But we looked at it.
Let's take one more question.
I'm Charlie Rose. I'm not the guy on television.
I could tell.
First of all,
First of all, he went to Duke. He's from North Carolina.
I know he went. I did not go to Duke. I apologize. I didn't go to UNC. I apologize for
You're
that. Also.
undereducated. That's all right.
That might be true. The question I have is essentially, first of all, I thoroughly enjoyed your commentary because I think it's right on the mark. But for some reason, the political landscape is not able to embrace change. And we have asset bubbles. We've had asset bubbles in many asset classes over the years. We had one just recently in housing. We had one in technology, as we all know. And we're having one in the bond market. And we're having probably one also in commodities. And when these bubbles burst, they tend to create shattering events. And we also have an arbitrage between the developed world and the developed world. The developing world is on a path of growth and savings. It may have a path that is tempered, as you mentioned earlier, but it's on a path that the 21st century recognizes as quite substantial. The question I have for you is that how does one reconcile the developing world's growth and its ability to educate its society, to invest in its economies, and to save and to grow versus a developed world which is on a path of essentially ending in, as the Greek experience is showing you, of violence. And I'm not sure the political landscape, one of the things you mentioned earlier, I happen to be a Democrat, but I don't see the Democrats getting there. And I see the Republicans sat over the housing bubble, and they didn't even know how to deal with that. So the question is that how do you bring the process together to create a dialogue, to, I hate to use the word, to nudge the parties. You have to nudge the parties. Otherwise, what you said earlier is quite ugly. And it's ugly for everyone in this room.
Yeah, look, I agree it's ugly.
And it can get much uglier because bubbles bursting are very ugly.
Let me tell you what I'm worried about, which I think will answer the question to some extent. I do think we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. I do think the fiscal path we're on is unsustainable, and I do think these deficits are like a cancer, and I really do believe they'll destroy the country from within. I think it's easy to see. I do think we're in a structural contraction that will lead to a period of low growth and high unemployment. You know, if you look at the current economic statistics that you all look here at the business school all the time, you know, we have literally no growth in the economy. We don't have any gains in employment when you consider putting any kind of aging factor in there and the increase in the population. Unemployment's over 9%, but it's really over 16% when you add in the people who aren't looking for a job or giving up. And that's the highest it's been in 17 years. If you just look at the labor participation rate, it's 64% now. You know, that's the lowest it's been in 27 years. And then you try to think, you know, how is it affecting people? If you talk about the great middle class, you know,
You're destroying it.
median household income is its lowest level in 13 years. Male wages have been stagnant for 40 years. Wages as a percent of income are at their lowest level since 1983. And then you think about the poor. You know, our poverty rates are at a 52-year high. We have 46 million people living below the poverty line. 27% of African Americans, 26% of Hispanics, 22% of children. No wonder we have this Occupy Wall Street. The gap between the haves and have-nots have grown immeasurably large. You know, whereas, you know, in real terms, our gap is as large as it is in Iran or Uganda. And this is America. And you think about the limits we have on what we can do about it because of this huge debt overhang. And you think about the things that these people in Congress ought to be working on today. Our infrastructure really is crumbling. Hell, all you got to do is ride on, you know, on the FDR to see that. Education. If you think the kids coming out of K through 12 today are anywhere close to globally competitive, you are crazy. I just got back from Singapore. 44% of their eighth graders this year scored at the most advanced level in math and science. In the U.S., less than 2% of our kids do. And less than 34% of them are even proficient, much less at the most advanced level. And you know what happens to those eighth graders here in New York? It's true throughout the country. For every 100 eighth graders in America, somewhere between 58 and 60 graduate from high school. 38 of those go to college. 28 come back for the second year, and 18 graduate. And you think we're going to compete in a knowledge-based global economy with that kind of record? I don't think so. So you have a crumbling infrastructure, you have a education system that is in bad need of repair and restructuring. You have a healthcare system, which I already talked about, which is pitiful. I mean, literally, to spend twice as much as anybody else and rank 25th to 50th in most of the outcome measurements, that is crazy. And then you look at, supposedly the backbone of America is our flexibility and our ability to create jobs and the innovation and small business. Well, new business starts have been declining in America for 30 years. There's a reason for that. We've got to come together. This partisan divide in Washington, that's caused by the extreme right and the extreme left, is causing us to put off dealing with any problems. And our generation can't leave it to the next generation who'll sit in these chairs 20 years from now.
I'm voting for you.
So anyway, I want to deal with it. I want us. That's why I'm so desperate to get people to come together, to put politics aside, and to pull together rather than pull apart, and try to address these long-term problems. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.